Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that we currently have 2 applications out for the King's Indian on iPhone and on Android. Check them out. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at an unusual position which could arrive out of the Queen's Gambit after the moves pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, and now the strange looking move bishop to e6. Now, quickly, by taking a look at this position, I want to review some of the most common things we need to do whenever we encounter a new move in the opening. The first thing to do is to remember that there are not only strategic but tactical aspects to a chess game as well. Strategic aspects are those which tend to be long-term. In this case, when White opens up with the Queen's Gambit his goal is to dissuade the pawn from maintaining its position on the d5 square so that eventually White can play the move pawn to e4. The whole idea is to gain a space advantage in the center and then develop the pieces in better position than Black's pieces. However, when Black plays the move bishop to e6, he's avoiding this idea in a very strange way, but it does appear that White could simply capture pawn takes pawn on d5, bishop takes pawn on d5, and that White could then play knight to c3. But this is where tactical aspects of chess strategy come in. Before we move so quickly, we need to use our imagination and our calculative abilities to assess exactly what's going to happen after the move pawn takes d5 or any other move which White might try in the position. And to begin with, the best thing to do is to establish some candidate moves, meaning different alternatives of how to continue. Now, one option is to do pawn takes pawn on d5. Other options in this position which look quite natural are to develop the knight to c3 or develop the knight to f3. And I have an opinion about which of these moves is best. Now let's start with the move pawn takes pawn on d5, visualizing as much as possible. Black will continue with bishop takes d5, and now the idea would be to play knight to c3, planning the move pawn to e4. Now, what is Black going to play in this position? He's certainly going to go for the move knight to f6. And in this case, now if White simply continues with knight takes d5, queen takes d5, knight to f3, and knight to c6, I believe that Black is actually very close to equality in this position because he's close to achieving the move pawn to e5 as well as castle's queen side. And so this is an example of how things could go terribly wrong for White because Black hasn't done very much well in this opening. He simply brought his bishop out to the e6 square, but somehow we've drifted into a position which is absolutely okay for Black and even preferable. He's equalizing the game right away in this position. Instead of playing like this, it turns out that the move knight to c3 has some excellent advantages. Now, after Black plays the move knight to f6, we can continue with knight to f3. Now, Black has to look for a move, and because his bishop is out on the e6 square, this bishop is actually a little bit misplaced. And again, any move like d takes c4 could now be met with the move pawn to e4, likely followed by d5 and bishop takes c4 with a clear spatial advantage. On the other hand, Black's bishop, if it attempts to develop with the move pawn to g6, the bishop on e6 can now be targeted with knight to g5. And this would actually lead to a decisive advantage if Black were to continue bishop to g4, since now the move queen to b3 ushers in dual threats of c takes d5 and queen takes b7. And after the move knight to g5, if Black simply continues with bishop to c8, I believe the opportunity with c takes d5, knight takes d5, queen to b3, eyeing both d5 and f7, followed by pawn to e6, and pawn to e4 looks very strong for white. White has occupied the center with pawns. The move pawn to e6 is difficult for black in two ways. The bishop on c8 is now prevented from being able to come out from the pawn chain, and the bishop on g7 now has to choose between either diagonal. For example, knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop to g7. Now white can look at this diagonal in the long term. There are some weakened dark squares for black in this position. Also bringing the pawn up to e5 and rerouting this knight to e4 with bishop to g5 could also be another plan for white in this position. Therefore, in the position which occurs after bishop to e6, knight to c3, knight to f6, knight to f3. If black continues with pawn to g6, this move knight to g5 definitely gives white an advantage, and this would be worth seeing in advance. On the other hand, if black continues with the move knight to c6, it appears that white will have an advantage after pawn takes pawn on d5, knight takes pawn on d5, and now white, rather than playing the move pawn to e4, white can simply play pawn to e3 with the idea of bishop to d3, and white will maintain two pawns versus one in the center. His bishop, his dark light squared bishop, will be able to find a better position than black's light squared bishop, and all in all, it's safe to say that white has a safe and healthy advantage in this position. The key from this video to take away is that, as always, when we encounter an unusual move in the opening, we have to be careful not to make just the stereotyped moves, such as pawn takes pawn on d5, bishop takes pawn on d5, knight c3 followed by taking, but use our calculative ability to think ahead just a little bit and to anticipate some of the various options which are available. If we do so successfully, it can mean the difference between exploiting the move, which is otherwise inaccurate, or it could be the difference between falling into a position which the opponent is comfortable with. So we definitely want to be sensitive every step of the way. That's all for today, and we'll see you again soon. Before you go, if you have an opportunity, be sure to check out that we have 3 applications available on the Queen's Gambit Decline, available for iPhone and for Android. Check them out.